The moment Adolf Hitler finally began to understand that Germany was losing the war did not arrive with a single report or one devastating sentence, but crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across everything he believed, and it started on a night when the bunker felt colder than usual, when even the walls seemed to listen as he stood over the map table, staring at front lines that no longer moved according to his will. And for the first time in years, the man who had built his power on certainty felt hesitation, because every symbol on that map told the same story. Armies that no longer existed, territories lost beyond recovery, and enemies advancing without resistance. And though he told himself it was temporary, that setbacks were part of war, his voice lacked conviction, and those standing around him felt it. The generals who once feared his confidence now feared his instability, because Hitler began repeating the same phrases, insisting that Germany could not lose, that destiny would not allow it. Yet destiny was silent, and as reports arrived one after another describing destroyed divisions, empty fuel depots, and soldiers retreating without orders, something inside him shifted, and the realization began not as acceptance, but as anger. Sudden violent outbursts where he blamed betrayal, incompetence, and weakness, slamming his fists on the table and shouting that his commanders had failed him, that the German people were not worthy of the sacrifices required for victory, and yet, beneath the rage, was panic, because rage was the only thing keeping the truth at bay. And as days passed inside the bunker, Hitler's world grew smaller, the air heavier, the conversations shorter, and the hope thinner, until strategy meetings became rituals of denial where imaginary units were ordered to attack and victories were planned. That would never happen. And when one officer quietly mentioned that reserves were exhausted and reinforcements impossible, May 1945, somewhere in Germany. The war didn't end with a bang for Private Tom Gallagher. It ended with a quiet that felt wrong. The guns stopped first. Then the planes. Then, slowly, the shouting faded. What remained was a heavy stillness, broken only by wind moving through shattered buildings and the distant rumble of trucks hauling supplies into a country that barely existed anymore. Tom sat on the steps of a ruined schoolhouse, helmet off, rifle resting beside him. His hands were scarred now. Burns, cuts, dirt worked so deep into the skin it might never come out. He stared at the horizon, half expecting something else to explode. Nothing did. A sergeant walked past and said, almost casually, "It's over, Gallagher." Tom nodded, but the words didn't land. Not yet. Across Germany, the evidence of what the war had become lay everywhere. Cities flattened, roads clogged with refugees, prison camps open to daylight, their survivors thin as shadows, eyes hollow with things no one should ever see. Tom and his unit were ordered to help process one such camp. The smell hit first. Sickness, death, despair soaked into the ground itself. Men stepped carefully, voices low, jokes gone. A medic nearby whispered, "Jesus Christ." Tom didn't say anything. He couldn't. The realization came slowly, like a tightening in his chest. This wasn't just about battles won or lost. This was what unchecked hatred and fear had built when the world looked away. In a small town along the Rhine, Major Bill Harris stood on a bridge that hadn't existed a month earlier. American and British soldiers moved past him, relaxed now, laughing in short bursts that felt tentative, like they weren't sure laughter was allowed anymore. That night, Tom wrote his first letter home in weeks. "Ma, the war's over. I'm still here. I don't know how to explain what we saw, but I need you to know why we had to stop him. All of it. I just want to come home." He folded the paper carefully, as if the act itself. Bill watched the river flow beneath the planks, steady and indifferent. He thought about classrooms, about maps that once seemed abstract, about how history books would try to explain this war with dates and arrows and treaties, but how they'd never fully capture the cost. An American lieutenant approached. "Sir, HQ's asking if you want to head back early, stateside." Bill hesitated. The word home carried weight now. "Yes," he said finally. "I think it's time." Back in Ohio, Margaret Harris heard the church bells before she heard the news. People spilled into the streets, hugging, crying, waving flags they'd kept tucked away for years. Radios blared President Truman's voice, steady and firm. The war in Europe was over. Margaret sank into a chair, hands shaking. Relief came first, sharp and overwhelming. Then fear, then hope. Weeks later, Bill stepped off a train, thinner, grayer, eyes older than when he'd left. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She just held him, feeling his breath against her shoulder, grounding herself in the fact that he was real. That night, lying in bed, Bill stared at the ceiling. "They let it happen," he said quietly. Margaret turned toward him. "Who?" "All of us," he replied. "By waiting, by hoping someone else would stop it." At night, Tom lay awake, listening to the wind move through cornfields instead of artillery. Sometimes he woke up sweating, heart racing, convinced he was still in France or Belgium or Germany. She reached for his hand. "But you did." He squeezed back. Too late for a lot of people. Tom Gallagher came home in the fall of 1945. The farm looked smaller than he remembered. The fields quieter. His mother cried when she saw him, hands pressed to his face like she was afraid he'd disappear. His father clapped him on the back, eyes shining, saying nothing. One evening, sitting on the porch, his father asked, "You think it was worth it?" Tom thought about Charlie, about Eddie, about the little girl with the bee. "Yes," he said slowly, "but I wish we'd stopped it sooner." Across the world, flags changed, borders shifted, leaders fell, new alliances formed. The United Nations was born from the wreckage, an attempt, however fragile, to prevent another catastrophe shaped by desperation and silence. Historians would say World War II began in 1939, but the men who fought it knew better. It began when hunger met anger, when fear met ambition, when the world mistook patience for peace. Hitler's rise had not just reshaped Germany. It had tested the conscience of an entire world, and the cost of that test was written in graves stretching from the Pacific to Europe. Years later, Tom Gallagher stood at a memorial, reading names etched into stone. He ran his fingers over one, Weiss, Charles, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Around him, children laughed. Tourists took photos. Life moved forward. That, he realized, was the victory. Not parades, not speeches, but the chance for a future where someone else might never have to learn these lessons the hard way. He stepped back, took a breath, and walked on, carrying the weight of history, and the hope that remembering it might keep the world from repeating it. That Germany could not be losing, because for over a decade he had built his entire identity on the belief that destiny itself was on his side. Yet the reports on the table told a brutal story. Entire armies annihilated, cities reduced to rubble, fuel supplies nearly gone, and soldiers retreating without orders, while his generals stood motionless, afraid to speak, knowing that every truth spoken in that room felt like a death sentence. And as the weight of failure pressed down on him, Hitler began repeating the same words again and again, blaming betrayal, incompetence, and cowardice, insisting that if only his commands had been followed perfectly, victory would still be within reach. But even as he spoke, his hands trembled, revealing what his words could not hide, that the war he had promised would last weeks had turned into a nightmare, consuming millions of lives. And when one officer carefully mentioned that the Red Army was advancing faster than expected and that reserves no longer existed, Hitler snapped, his face turning pale, shouting that Germany would fight to the last man, that surrender was unthinkable. And yet, after the rage faded, something far more dangerous replaced it. Quiet denial. Because deep down, he understood that no speeches, no miracles, and no last-minute weapons could reverse what was already unfolding. And as the days passed, Hitler's tone changed from absolute certainty to desperate insistence, repeatedly asking for updates that no longer brought hope, only confirmation of collapse, and he began speaking of imagined divisions that existed only in his mind, ordering attacks by units that had already been destroyed, while outside the bunker Berlin burned, civilians fled, and the empire he had built through fear and fanaticism crumbled piece by piece. And it was during one such briefing, after hearing that entire fronts had collapsed simultaneously, that Hitler finally said the words his generals had waited years to hear. Not an admission of guilt, but an admission of defeat, whispering that the war was lost because the German people had failed him, because they were too weak to endure the sacrifices he demanded, a statement that revealed how completely he had separated himself from reality. And at that moment, the room understood that the man who once commanded Europe was now a prisoner of his own delusions, isolated not only by concrete walls, but by the refusal to accept responsibility. And here is where I want to ask you watching this right now. From where in the world are you watching this video? Because the story of this collapse is not just German history. It is a warning to everyone. And as Hitler retreated further into isolation, he spoke less of strategy and more of fate, claiming that history would one day understand him, that future generations would see him as a misunderstood figure rather than a failed leader, even as his remaining advisors quietly prepared for the end. Knowing that Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when, and in private conversations, Hitler admitted that he had trusted the wrong people, that his generals lacked loyalty, yet never once did he accept that his own decisions, opening multiple fronts, underestimating enemies, and ignoring logistical reality, had sealed Germany's fate. And as Allied forces closed in from all sides, Hitler's words became increasingly detached from the battlefield, filled with fantasies of reversal and sudden salvation. But when the final reports confirmed that Berlin was surrounded and relief would never come, the truth finally crushed him completely. And he reportedly said that everything he had built was now meaningless, that the struggle had been in vain, not because the cause was wrong in his eyes, but because the world had failed to rise to his vision. And in those final days, as the sounds of artillery echoed above the bunker, Hitler spoke of death not as fear, but as escape. How a global crisis had allowed a single ideology to turn nations into battlefields. The war wasn't just about territory or power. It was about whether the world would learn, too late or just in time, that ignoring fire doesn't stop it from spreading. As the ship cut through the water, Bill tightened his grip on the railing. Somewhere ahead, men were waiting with guns. Somewhere behind, families were praying. And somewhere, decisions made years ago by frightened politicians, by desperate populations, were about to be paid for in blood. The catastrophic course of World War II was no longer a warning, it was a reality. North Africa, November 1942. Operation Torch. The desert smelled like hot metal and dust. A dry heat that stuck to the back of your throat and never let go. Private Tom Gallagher lay pressed into the sand, helmet low over his eyes, heart hammering so loud he was sure the Germans could hear it. "Don't bunch up," Sergeant Collins hissed. "Keep your spacing." Ahead of them, the horizon flickered, muzzle flashes popping like camera bulbs in the dark. This wasn't the neat, heroic war the recruiting posters promised. This was confusion, sand in your mouth, sweat running down your spine, fear so thick it felt like another piece of gear weighing you down. Tom gripped his rifle and tried not to think about Eddie, tried not to think about Pearl Harbor, tried not to think at all. "Move!" Collins barked. They surged forward, boots crunching over rock and grit. Machine gun fire ripped across the ground, kicking up little explosions of sand. A man to Tom's left went down screaming, clutching his leg. Medics crawled toward him, low and fast. This was America's war now, fought far from home, against an enemy born from years of desperation and unchecked ambition. While men like Tom fought across deserts and jungles, Captain Bill Harris stood in a dimly lit command tent, sweat darkening the collar of his uniform. Maps covered the table. North Africa, Italy, Europe itself. Colored pins marked progress measured in miles and bodies. "This war didn't start with bullets," Bill said quietly to a younger lieutenant beside him. "It started with fear, hunger, people believing a strong man could fix what the world broke." The lieutenant nodded, eyes tired. "Hard lesson to learn this way, sir." Across the Atlantic, the consequences of Hitler's rise were tightening like a vice. German U-boats prowled the ocean, sending American ships to the bottom in flaming wrecks. In the skies over Europe, bombers clawed through flak-filled darkness, crews praying engines would hold and luck would last one more mission. In England, young American pilots drank weak coffee and joked too loudly, hiding terror behind bravado. "See you back here," one would say before a mission. Sometimes they meant it, sometimes they didn't. By 1943, the war had become global in every sense. In the Pacific, Marines fought island by island, every foot of ground paid for in blood. In Europe, Allied bombers turned German cities into infernos of fire and steel. The air itself seemed at war. Tom Gallagher found himself in Italy that summer, climbing hills under artillery fire that never seemed to stop. The land was beautiful. Olive trees, stone villages, ancient churches, scarred now by shell holes and graves marked with simple, wooden crosses. One night, pinned down by enemy fire, Tom shared a foxhole with a kid from Brooklyn named Charlie Weiss. "You ever think about why all this started?" Charlie asked, voice low. Tom shook his head. "I just know we gotta finish it." Charlie nodded. "Yeah, just wish it hadn't taken the whole damn world to realize what he was." They fell silent as shells burst overhead, the sky lighting up like a broken thunderstorm. Back home, America was changing too. In Ohio, Bill Harris's wife, Margaret, worked long shifts at a factory stamping out aircraft parts. Her hands were rough now, nails chipped, hair tied back tight. Every night she sat at the kitchen table, reading letters by lamplight, counting the days between them. One letter arrived smudged and thin from somewhere in Italy. Still standing, Bill had written, "Tell the kids I'll be home when this is over." She pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closed, listening to the distant whistle of a train carrying more boys east, then south, then into history. As 1944 approached, the war's weight pressed harder. Casualty lists grew longer. Victories came, but never cleanly. Always at a cost. In Normandy, American soldiers waited aboard landing craft, seas rough beneath them, sky gray and unforgiving. Among them was Tom Gallagher, knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. The ramp slammed down. Chaos followed. Men fell before they took 3 steps. Water turned red. Orders dissolved into screams. But they kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and because somewhere deep down they understood this beach mattered. Hitler's war machine had been built on fear and silence. It would be broken by men who refused both. Tom dragged himself forward, breath ragged, heart pounding, the roar of battle filling his ears. Around him, America bled, but it did not retreat. Above the beach, smoke rolled inland. The global crisis that had begun with treaties and speeches was now being answered the only way left, with everything. As night fell over Normandy, the fighting didn't stop. It never really did anymore. And somewhere ahead, beyond hedgerows and ruined towns, the final reckoning waited. Normandy, France, July 1944. The hedgerows were alive with death. They rose from the earth like walls, thick, tangled, ancient, perfect places to hide a machine gun or a man with nothing left to lose. Private Tom Gallagher crouched behind one of them, back slick with sweat, fingers numb around his rifle. The air smelled of damp soil, cordite and rot. Somewhere ahead, a German MG-42 chattered, the sound fast and merciless, ripping through leaves and bark like paper. "Jesus, it won't stop," Charlie Weiss muttered beside him, eyes wide, helmet tilted low. "It only stops when we move," Sergeant Collins snapped. His face was grey with exhaustion, voice hoarse from shouting over artillery for weeks. "On my signal!" Tom swallowed. His mouth was dry. He thought of Iowa fields, flat, open, forgiving. This land was none of those things. "Now!" They went over the hedgerow in a rush of bodies and noise. Grenades flew. Dirt exploded upward. Someone screamed. Tom ran because everyone else was running, because standing still meant becoming a target. He fired without knowing if he hit anything, ears ringing, heart slamming against his ribs. When it was over, the machine gun was silent. The hedgerow was shredded. 2 Americans lay still in the grass. Charlie sat down hard, staring at his hands. "We're still here," he whispered, like he couldn't quite believe it. Tom nodded, chest heaving. Still here. That was victory now. Across the battlefield of Europe, the war had reached its boiling point. Hitler's empire, built on intimidation, speed, and the world's hesitation, was cracking under relentless pressure. Cities burned nightly under Allied bombs. Supply lines stretched thin. And on the Eastern Front, the Red Army was grinding forward with a brutality that stunned even seasoned commanders. Captain Bill Harris, now a major, stood in a ruined farmhouse outside St. Lo, listening to artillery thunder like a distant storm. He traced his finger along a map, watching arrows creep eastward, westward, closing in. "All this," he said to no one in particular, "because the world waited too long." A young intelligence officer looked up. "Sir?" Bill shook his head. "Never mind. Just thinking out loud." But he couldn't stop thinking about it. The humiliation after World War I, the hunger, the speeches that promised pride and delivered ruin, the diplomats who hoped peace could be negotiated with a man who only understood force. This, Normandy, Italy, the Pacific, the skies over Germany. This was the bill coming due. In December 1944, winter fell hard over Europe. Snow covered the Ardennes forest, muffling sound, hiding movement. American troops, many exhausted and under-equipped, dug shallow foxholes in frozen ground. Tom Gallagher pulled his coat tighter, teeth chattering, breath fogging the air. "You hear that?" Charlie asked quietly. Tom listened. The forest was too quiet. Then the guns opened up. German artillery slammed into American positions, trees exploding into splinters. Tanks followed, dark shapes emerging from the snow like ghosts. It was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to break Allied momentum and force a negotiated peace. "Hold the line!" officers shouted. They held because there was nowhere else to go. For days, the fighting was savage and close. Ammunition ran low. Food froze solid. Medics worked until their hands shook. Men died nameless in white fields far from home. One night, under a sky bright with flares, Charlie Weiss was hit. Tom dragged him behind a tree, hands slippery with blood. "Stay with me," Tom begged. Charlie tried to smile. Guess Brooklyn's gonna miss me." He died before the snow stopped falling. Tom sat there long after, numb, staring at nothing, until a sergeant shook him. By early 1945, it was clear, even to Hitler's own generals, that the end was coming. Germany was being crushed from both sides. Cities lay in ruins. Refugees clogged roads. The myth of invincibility was gone. In Berlin, Hitler ranted in underground bunkers, maps shrinking with every report. The global crisis that had lifted him to power now buried him beneath its weight. Major Bill Harris stood with Allied officers along the Rhine, watching engineers throw bridges across the river under fire. American tanks rolled east. There was no stopping them now. "Whatever comes next," one British officer said, "the world won't forget this." Bill nodded. It shouldn't. April 1945. Germany was dying. Tom Gallagher moved through a shattered town, rubble crunching under his boots. Civilians emerged slowly from cellars, old men, women, children, faces hollow, eyes wary. This was the enemy's home now, and it looked nothing like the monster he'd imagined. A little girl stared at him from a doorway, clutching a doll with no arm. When the news came, Hitler dead, the Reich collapsing, it didn't arrive with celebration, just silence. Men sat down where they stood. Some laughed weakly. Some cried. Some stared at the ground, thinking of the friends who wouldn't be going home. Tom thought of Eddie, of Charlie, of all the names etched into memory instead of stone. The catastrophic course of the war, set in motion years before anyone fired a shot, had finally burned itself out. But the cost lingered in every ruined street, every empty bunk, every family forever changed. As church bells rang cautiously across liberated towns, Tom realized something with a clarity that hurt. The war wasn't just over. It had marked them, and nothing, not victory, not peace, would ever make them the same again.